All right. So first thing first is some business points. Again, November 5th, end of day. Why is this written on the board? Yeah, that's the last day I'll accept late homeworks. Again, if you need to ask if you have any outstanding, or just to be safe, if you want to send things to me again, feel free. I just don't want to fail anyone who had their homeworks done. I mean, if you had already sent them and my email just treated you like spam or something, I'd of course give you credit. But I just want to make sure. End of November 5th, that's Friday. If, it's Thursday and you need another day or so, just let me know. I'm not going to be super strict if you let me know ahead of time. But if you have not let me know yet, then you get a 0 on it, right?
Did you already send us back number 6?
No, I have not. I meant to do it today, and then I had an emergency meeting, and then I didn't get to, so I'm gonna send it back tomorrow. But everyone who turned one in got 100 on it because they were all lovely and delightful, so don't stress about them too much. There were some very entertaining ads. I very much enjoy them. It's really just an excuse for me to watch old commercials, which are very fun. I feel like, I know you mentioned it, Lauren, how like commercials can really just take you back to a certain point in your childhood. There are like so many commercials that I just like, I know exactly where I was and when I was the first time I saw it. All right, so that's the first thing. The second thing is rearranging readings. But basically what I mean is I'm changing around what we're covering next week and covering the week after. So basically, instead of covering in 2 weeks privacy and next week, what is it? Next week was going to be hate speech and democracy and the internet. I'm switching around the order. So next week, we're going to be talking about privacy. So basically, next week's topic is going to be your computer and your phone know everything about you. Google's tracking you all the time, and they're doing a lot of weird stuff with it. Is that morally right, and should you be concerned? That's what next week's topic is going to be, is in a modern world in which you're being tracked all the time, should you care about privacy? Why do we even care about privacy? That's what we'll be discussing. And it's also just like learning all the fun things that companies do with your data, which the more you learn, the scarier it gets. So that'll be that next week. So I'm going to send out the readings, just like there's nothing different that's on the syllabus. It's just the order's switched. And let's be honest, we're at that point of the semester where I'm talking to a small fraction of you all anyway. So, but I will just send it out and let everyone know. You already have the readings. It's just I'm switching the order, and we're at that point in the semester, whatever. All right. So those are the 2 business things. Any business questions? Again, end of November 5th, you need to turn in homeworks to me, all your homeworks, any leftovers. I will probably take off a tiny bit of credit, like a 1/3 of a grade or something like that, not much. After this date, though, if I haven't heard from you at all, you haven't emailed me anything, then it's just going to be a 0 on any that aren't turned in. Now, if you could show me that you sent them to me and I fucked up, then you'll get your credit and all. I'm not going to be like a complete tyrant about this, but I'm definitely, if you email me on like December 5th and we're like, I didn't know that I had to turn in late homework, so then you're going to be shit out of luck. But anyway, all right. Any questions on that stuff? Where did I put my high-tech eraser? All right. So today's topic is going to be twofold. One, we're going to finish up. Oh, Noel's here. Yay. All right. So I'm just going to leave this date written up here. All right. All right. So today's twofold. One, we're finishing up the second thing that we were going to talk about last time. And the other is we're going to talk about what cultural relativism is and why people believe it and why it's not a completely crazy theory and it's actually got a lot going for it and is still very much an alive view. Before we get to that, though, we get to talk about this stupid long word, deontology. No worries. Yes. All right. So basically what we talked about last time was what? Anyone remember?
That's what I was about to ask you.
Yeah. So it was a C word and then a U word.
Wait, I got utilitarian.
Utilitarianism was the second one. Utilitarianism, which is a version of consequentialism. And these were Consequentialism is a general moral theory that says the right thing to do in any situation is the one with the best consequences. And then a particular version of that is utilitarianism. And utilitarianism said what makes something the right thing to do?
It's the happiest
Yeah.
or the least suffering.
Exactly. It's the one that leads to the most pleasure or happiness and the least suffering or pain.
Does that mean that the first one means that there's just like only one answer that is right?
So what the first one, no, so that's, let me erase that. Okay, so we've got ethics. Within ethics, you've got a view of one right answer only, which would be objectivism. So these are any sort of theories that think there's only one answer. Then there's, I guess there are a few different types of things. One of them we'll be talking about is cultural relativism, which is, what's the best way of putting this? Answer is relative to culture. There are some other views we won't be discussing, like fictionalism is the view that all morality is a fiction, it's all an illusion, nothing's right or wrong, and it's never right or wrong. We all just lie to ourselves to make ourselves feel good at night, but really it's just pointless. So that's another one. We won't be discussing that one. Pardon? That's either fictionalism or nihilism, or there's a few different versions of it. Fictionalism would say it's a fiction that is useful. We keep it around because it's a useful lie. There's not really anything right or wrong, but we tell ourselves there are because it keeps people in line. And then like a nihilist view, which let me just, I can never spell nihilism, is the view like there's nothing and none of it matters and we should get rid of it and everything is pointless and yada yada. So, but yeah, fictionalism is like the idea we came up with a useful lie to keep people in line and it keeps us in line. So even though there's no moral truth, but those aren't things we're going to be talking about here. Take an ethics class. They're super fascinating, really interesting, but not what we'll be discussing here. So one right answer is objectivism. Within this, we have consequentialism, and that says there's always one right answer and it's a matter of the consequences. And then within that, there are a few different versions, but the most famous one is utilitarianism. And that is the idea that the one right thing to do in any given situation is whichever one will have the best consequences. And then the other objectivist view we're going to talk about is what's called deontology. And deontology comes from, and we're going to talk about Kant's deontology because that's the most famous one that everyone talks about. And deontology has to do with duty, or what you have a responsibility to do. And we'll explain in a second what this means and how it comes out of like why we have any motivations for this, etc. But that's the first bit. This is our little chart of how they all fit together. Who just came in? Makai came in. I know we're rolling in people now. That sounds unpleasant though. All right. No, I'm not going to erase that. I was just erasing that line. It looked ugly up there. I didn't like it. That says one right answer only. I genuinely thought that said lightsaber. Sometimes I genuinely cannot read my own handwriting sometimes. It just gets worse as the semester goes along. All right, well, actually, you know what? While you write that down, I will begin my drawing for the next part. So, thank you, those of you who can read my handwriting better than I can. Should consider paleontology or archaeology as a career. Yeah, this is not a good, this is too bad. Better.
The one circle.
Deontology, Kant, Kant apostrophe S. So it's a man. It's a guy named Immanuel Kant. We'll talk about him in a second. But basically, we're going to motivate the view now of what is this deontology thing and why is it a moral theory? Why aren't we? We talked last time about some of the issues with. Actually, is this showing up on screen? Can you see all 5 people here, computer people? Is that visible to you? There should be 5 stick figures.
Yeah.
Okay. I guess I can teach from over here so you can actually see it. All right. So bless you. Basically, last time we talked about some of the issues with utilitarianism. And one of the things I want to do now is use one of those issues to motivate this other view, deontology. So the classic version of the trolley problem is similar to what we talked about last time with missiles launching and everything. But imagine a case in which you've got trolley on tracks, 5 people on one side, 1 person on another. The train or the trolley is going to run over the 5 people. Unless you press a button, it'll change directions and run over the 1. Many people, not everyone, have the feeling that in that case, it makes sense to press the button, save 5 people, and have 1 get run over. Now, this is a variation of the problem. So imagine this train is choo-chooing along, and you've got 5 people on the track, same as before. Now, the train doesn't have a button or anything. Rather, there's a footbridge over top of this train track. You are up here on this footbridge, as is a complete stranger. Now, you, for some unknown reason, know a lot about trains, and you recognize that this train that's coming down the tracks has an emergency braking system, such that if it hits something that weighs 100 pounds or more, it will automatically brake and stop. This train, though, if nothing stops it, is going to run over those 5 people, and it won't brake in time, and all 5 of them will die. However, you recognize that up here on the platform next to you is this person that if you were to push this person and they were to tumble off the bridge in front of the train, it would stop the train, thereby 1 person would die and 5 would live. Now, before you want to say that you'd be a hero and jump off yourself, you've had a bad super glue accident and your feet are glued to the bridge. You cannot move. All you can do is push. So we now have the same 2 questions we had last time, which is 1, how many of you think the right thing to do is push this stranger in front of the train? And how many of you would push the stranger in front of the train to stop the train to save the 5? So would anyone push them? Out of curiosity, would anyone? Does anyone think it's the right thing to do and you just don't have the courage to? This is the pretty normal response to this. Nita.
I think that I wouldn't be able to.
I mean, I feel similarly. I don't think I could push someone in front of a train in this context. And
But what if the other people at risk were like your family members?
so I guess, yeah, would you do it for your family members? That's another good question. If these were your family, would you do it?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
I think that is something similar. Well, on the other side, if this was your mother, you'd absolutely not push, or your child, even more so. Actually, interestingly, there are a lot of cultural differences about who you would be most likely to save in a case. They've done studies around the world of like you're in a boat that's going down and you can only save 1. It's you, your child, your partner, your mother, and your grandmother, and different cultures give different answers for who they'd be most likely to save. But I just think it's fascinating because within a given culture, it seems obvious, like the right one. Ursula.
I was talking to a friend of mine about this class, and he asked about the same exact scenario. And then he asked if it was going to be a family member. So I said, if the person that I'd have to push was like my mom, I would be pushing. But the people on the tracks, they're like, you know, brother, sister, blah, blah, blah. So you don't know what to do.
And I think that's the thing. And what we're doing here, and I think part of the reason that it's useful to bring in family members in this is it's not just the consequences of like, you know, you're going to break a family apart, even if this is a complete stranger. It's rather there's something about your relationship to your mom and that mattering more. Or if these are your sisters or your brothers, there's something about that that matters a lot more. And just generally speaking, it also seems like there's just something about the act of pushing that matters in a way that pressing a button did not. And I think, because imagine now that instead of pushing this person, we had the case in which really what you were doing is pressing a button, the train would go this way and kill 1 person. how many people's feelings would be okay? Like, you don't feel great about pressing the button, but you'd be willing to do it, at least more so than you'd be willing to push this person off tracks. I think that's a pretty universal thing. So here's the question to go all philosophy on us. Why? What is the difference? What is it about the pushing that matters? And what I want to do here is highlight what matters about the pushing to motivate this other view of morality deontology. All right, I saw Lauren's hand first, then Kyriakos, then Olushola, then Netta, and I don't see any computer people. All right, fire away.
Well, I think you actually have to physically do it yourself. Like, you have to sacrifice the person yourself. In the other example, the person was on an island, so you didn't see the other person. You had no interaction with them, but like you actually have to physically stand there and kill the person. So you yourself really aren't saving the people; you're more killing them with more than you're actually saving. So.
All right, did I say Kyriakos a second? Yeah.
I'm looking more of it as a law aspect. I think by pushing somebody that you're you can go to jail.
So that's a big part of it. And here's the interesting thing. I think that in this case, it definitely plays a role that you could go to jail. But even if I told you, you're going to get away with it, I still having asked people, most people still, even if they know they're going to get away with it, feel a lot less. Some people are willing to switch sides and be like, if I know I'm going to get away with it, it's 5 versus 1, I'll do it. But that's the minority of people. There still feels something different. But I agree with you that something about it. Another way of putting this, though, is just to highlight the same point. Why does the law even care about the difference? Because the fact is the law puts more of an emphasis on this one versus the other. And where do the laws come from? Well, we write them. So there was clearly whatever motivated it being against the law is the same sort of oomphy sort of thing. Olushola.
I was gonna say the same thing she said. So one involves more interaction than the other.
So killing, interaction. There's something interaction. There does seem to be the fact that you're pushing the person, even the physical contact makes it even worse. Netta and then Gadi.
I think it's the matter of if you push him, you're playing God because you decide for that person that he's gonna die. And if the train runs into the people, it's you see the accident, you have no way to stop it, but you're not an active part in it.
So it's the active part and this playing God element. Yeah. Gadi.
I was gonna say you can't disembody yourself from the act like you would when it's someone on an island. You have to physically and consciously make that choice.
Yeah. And I think, so that's a big one. Yeah, this physical contact really matters. And I think another big one is this playing God element. A lot of people have this feeling of even if you press the button, and this I think goes back to the touching thing here where there's a bit of an overlap, in some sense you can tell yourself the missile is killing them, I just pressed the button. Well, if you are pushing a person onto the train, it feels much, much, much more bad in some sense. Well, here's the question then on the next level. What is it about the playing of God or the physically pushing, or what is it about the killing that is so much worse than the just letting die? Clearly, it's not the consequences because we've got one person dying and another person dying.
Because I think that one you can excuse. I mean, the not doing anything sort of thing. You can say, but how are you going to excuse murder?
Yeah, and so what is it though? What is it about this murder thing? Why is it that it's so inexcusable? Because I 100%.
The worst crime that humans can.
And here's, I think, what we're all falling back on, which is going to bring us to this notion of deontology. It just seems at some level that there's this rule that we have that says don't, in this sort of case, don't murder a bystander, a complete bystander for no reason. And it seems like this just universal rule is something that we feel no matter what the consequences are. There's something about the act of murdering someone that this is just a no-no. You cannot do it. And I think what it ties into is something about the act of doing this killing and really this act of playing God and making the decision. And so what I want to highlight here is the way that this man, Immanuel Kant, fleshes out this, and he really does put emphasis on the playing God bit. And so his idea, where's the board? let's use. His idea was this. The idea for why it's wrong to murder, regardless of the consequences, comes down to the nature of human beings and the fact that we are all on some ethical level equal. So all human beings are people with hopes and dreams and desires and families, and we all want to, in some important sense, we recognize in ourselves that we have value as a human being. And we also recognize in an abstract sense that all humans on some sense are valuable and that human life is a valuable thing. And therefore, because we're all equal, and I know I'm valuable, I need to recognize that everyone else is equally valuable in the broad moral sense of things. So the issue with murder is that to commit a murder is to treat somebody in a way that goes against this fundamental truth that we're all equal in some way. So what you're basically saying is, I wouldn't want someone to murder me. And we couldn't have a rule of murder me because I'm valuable and I'm special. But that person over there, they can be murdered. So Kant's idea was that the reason that we have just this fundamental it's wrong to kill is because in a certain sense, you're contradicting your just basic understanding of the fact that humans are valuable through your action. To value human life, everyone has desires and hopes and needs to be treated with respect. And then on the other hand, you're just disrespecting somebody with your actions. So this is the basic idea of his deontology. So his view, deontology, is based on this idea that you have a duty to treat human beings all equally. And because of this duty, it means that you cannot do actions that could not be applied equally to everybody. So he says that anything to count as moral, something has to be universal. What's the best way of putting this? Universal, this is a terrible word, but it's literally the translation of the German word he uses. Universalizable, as in you can make it the same or universal for everyone. So to test whether something is right or wrong, one way to do it is just you ask yourself, what would happen if everyone were to do this thing? Because we have to treat everyone equally. So if one person's allowed to do it, everyone has to be allowed to do it. That's the only way it's fair, and I'm not contradicting myself. So if you say something is universalizable, i.e. able to be universalized or able to be applied to everyone, then in a case in which if you say that something is, imagine everyone does it, if the world would be perfectly fine, then it's a morally acceptable thing. If, however, everyone doing it would lead to complete and utter chaos, or you can't even imagine it, what it would be for everyone to do it, then that thing is going to be morally wrong. So to go back, does that make sense to some way? Is everyone is equal, therefore any rule you come up with has to apply to everyone. However, when you apply certain rules to everyone, the result would be complete societal chaos and collapse, and you might not even be able to imagine what that would be like. That shows you that that's not universalizable. So if you do that thing, you're contradicting yourself, therefore it's wrong. So that's he kind of collapses moral wrongness into logical wrongness, which is this fascinating move. So I guess morality is critical thinking in a certain sense. So just to give an example of it, let's test out murder. So our example of this, why do we have this universal rule, do not murder? Well, what would happen if we were to universalize this? What would happen if we had a rule that said everyone can murder?
We'd all just end up killing each other.
Yeah, at the very least, society would collapse. And depending on how you want to define suicide, it might be impossible to even imagine everyone committing murder, because eventually you're going to run out of people. Unless you get the final two people to count to 3 and then pull a trigger at the exact same moment. It's really hard to imagine everyone murdering. So murder, not universalizable. Therefore, murder is wrong. What about going out to dinner with your friends? What would happen if everybody every once in a while went out to dinner with their friends? Fine. Society's not falling apart. Therefore, it's a morally acceptable thing to do. Going out with your friends, totally fine. What about breaking your promises? You can't break your promises. Why? What would happen if everyone was breaking their promises? Just think about how quickly,
You don't trust anyone.
you couldn't trust, just very quickly, everything would fall apart. Like, if you couldn't trust that I would, if I say this is your homework, and then I lie, and I'm just like, I lied, I gave you another homework, you did the wrong one, you get an F, like, that wouldn't work well. Or like, the judge says your court date's on Tuesday, and then you show up on Tuesday, like, it was yesterday, you're going to jail. Like, everything would fall apart. Curious.
Do you think like these moral rules would be followed even if there weren't any like actual laws implemented?
So I think there is some evidence that there are certain sorts of rules that we follow, even if there weren't laws over top of them. So I think there is a lot of, the archaeological evidence of like, basically how much are we a species that's designed for like a complete dog eat dog world where if we didn't have laws, it would be chaos. And how much are we actually more inclined to help each other if left out in the rainforest by ourselves? And of course, it ends up being somewhere in between, like all the evidence is somewhere in between. But there is a lot of evidence that humans will spontaneously assist each other. And it's not always just that we go into murder. Now, I do think that one of the keys is limited resources. If there's very limited resources and you put a lot of people together with no laws, then it turns into the Hunger Games rather quickly. And then same thing happens, like if you put chimpanzees nearby each other and there's plentiful food, they won't fight. But if you have a limited food source, then they will start to fight and brawl.
Do you think we're born with a moral compass, or do you think it's just nature?
So I have very interesting views on morality in terms of, my views change constantly. It definitely seems like there is some biological urge towards certain types of actions which we call moral. Like I think there, and especially for in-group members, like there are sorts of things of there is a general tendency towards truthfulness that seems somehow biologically evolved into us for evolutionary reasons of if you were a liar, you would very quickly get kicked out of your group and then you would die. So it does seem like one way we have evolved towards this is to have a tendency to feel lying is wrong on some biological level. Now, whether you want to say that means that lying is moral or whether like morality is a big lie and it's just our biology, that's the up in the air question. But I do think there's some evidence that there are certain types of actions that we are biologically programmed to avoid doing, whether it be for evolutionary reasons or something else. And I think there are also, another way you can kind of see is like every single society has stigmas against in-group murder. So like even the most like appalling murderous society in history, you weren't allowed to kill anyone. It was, you were still killing the outsiders within the group. Like to go with Nazi Germany, that it was still very wrong for a Nazi to kill another Nazi. Like that was murder, even within their crazy ethical standpoint. So it does seem like there are certain sorts of things that we are biologically programmed. Also, incest seems to be one that on some level we're biologically programmed to have some sort of disgust reaction about. And how it works is unclear because there's some evidence it's like genetics and others that it's more, you assume that whoever you grow up near is genetically similar to you. So generally people will get the same disgust reaction about step siblings, even if they're not biologically related together. So it seems like there are some fundamental ones, but I think as we'll talk about with the cultural relativism, on top of that, I think a lot of things that we think of as clear moral programmed are less. So my guess would be it's going to be a much smaller number of things that we typically assume, and not everyone would agree with this. Like there are people who will die on the it's all taught, it's all an illusion. But my gut feeling is the biology evidence suggests there's some things that we typically call moral that are programmed into us. Yeah, absolutely. These are great questions. I love questions like this.
Do you think morals can be followed without consequence?
Can morals be followed without consequence?
You think?
Like, are there good people who would do it even if there was no reward and no punishment? Or
I think people wouldn't do things if there weren't a consequence.
wait, give me an example. There are too many negatives here.
Let's just say there's no law on murder.
I think that it depends, and this is where I would say that there would probably be more if there were no consequences for your actions. My guess is there would be more murder than the true pacifist believers would want there to be. I think there would be some, and it would probably be somewhat higher than it is today. But again, that might be wrong. It might be that if you took away the law, there'd be less murder. I don't know. But my gut feeling is it would probably go up, especially if there were like limited resources. Because I mean, in a time in which, you know, a city's under a lockdown or there's a war going on and supplies are limited, people will use that opportunity to loot and get even and things like that. So my guess is there would be an increase, but I don't think that every single person would turn into a murderer necessarily just for murder. Now, I do think that in something like the zombie apocalypse, just about every one of us in the right circumstance would be capable of murder. Like, I think like anyone who has a kid, I think is probably going to be like, I would, if somebody came after my child, I would kill to protect my child. I think most of us, if a person came after those of us without kids, you come after my friends and this is the only way to stop you, I would possibly kill. And so also in the sort of thing of like, there's one can of vegetables left during the zombie apocalypse, and this is the, either you or me are going to survive. I think in that extreme situation, and also no consequences, I think in that extreme situation, humans would probably lean towards murdering at a higher rate than we like to think. Yeah. Great questions though. I love this sort of stuff. At any point, if you ever just want to like go off on a tangent on anything at all related, just go. I love talking, as you know. Voted most talkative in high school. All right. So yeah, this idea of, is it universalizable? So for him, murder is not, so according to Kant, it is wrong to murder in any circumstance, and anyone, even if there are no consequences, it's definitely wrong. Now, as we just said, I'm not sure whether that's programmed into us, but I kind of am of the view of there's going to be a certain circumstance in which, you know, maybe it's not even murder anymore. But that's the idea. Promise breaking, again, universalizable. Another way he kind of illustrates the same point, which I think can be useful to highlight, because it's basically giving the same idea from a slightly different angle and using different words, which can kind of help illustrate what he's talking about. I just wrote up the phrase means and ends up here. Have people heard these words together in context, possibly in the phrase, the ends justify the means?
Yeah.
What do they mean?
Well, it means when ends are sometimes like you do it in terms of like it's a means to an end of something. So it's like an answer to the end of to finalize something.
Yeah, so the end you can think of here is the final or the goal you have, and means are just whatever way you get there. So for instance, your end was to come to class, your means was to take the subway or log on to Zoom. That's means and ends. Your end is to make a great meal. Your means are getting the ingredients and cooking it. That's what means and ends mean. Now, Kant thinks that another way of illustrating this idea of what's right is by talking in terms of treating people as means and ends. And he says that another way of recognizing whether something is universalizable and okay is you ask yourself, if I were to do this action to someone, would I be treating them simply as a means, or would I be treating them at least partly as an end in themselves? Netta.
I just like to ask, is it the you and the other one?
So these are
two ways for the big word.
So here's basically the way to think of it. So Kant described his deontology in terms of a certain, I'm just going to write up Kant's principle. If you want to know what it's called in the most annoying way possible, it was called the categorical, you don't need to write this down unless you want to, categorical imperative. This is a phrase which you will sometimes see in like philosophy classes or things. I don't care about you knowing this word. It's a stupid phrase that's translated from German. But basically, his idea is that what makes something right or wrong is whether it adheres to this principle. And this principle can be described in one of either, and this is the overall principle from which all our individual duties follow. So we've got an individual duty to not lie. And where does that duty come from? Well, it falls out of this principle he has. And he says what this principle is either, one way of describing this magical principle is, can the particular action you're worrying about, can that be something everyone does? Murder, not universalizable. The other way he says, why is murder wrong? Well, he describes it in terms of means and ends. And so what he wants to say is, when you're committing murder, another way of describing why it's wrong, and another way of seeing that it violates this logical principle he describes, is that when you murder someone, or specifically in this case, in which people online, I'm pointing at the footbridge case from before, when you push someone in front of the train, you are using them as a means to your end exclusively. You are using them as a meat bag to stop a train. You aren't worried about them and their hopes and dreams. All you're doing is you are a physical object that I'm using as a tool to push in front of this train. And so that's what it is to use someone simply as a means. So he says that it's wrong in this case. So another way to recognize that it's wrong to murder is you recognize that murder is generally using someone simply as a means. To use someone as an end in themselves is to treat them with respect, take their feelings, their moral concerns into account. So just to show the contrast, if you imagine in this case, so we've had our judgment with the, well, first off, is all this making sense to everyone? I just want to make sure I'm not rambling too much. All right, in the original case, you just push this person. Now imagine an alternate world in which you are on the train, you see this, or you're on the bridge, you see this train coming, you know that you've had a super glue accident, so you can't launch yourself in front of the train. You tap the person in front of you on the shoulder and you say, "Excuse me, sir, madam," or however you choose to identify. "I'm looking to, I see this train coming and it's going to hit those 5 people over there. I have had a super glue accident. I can't jump in front of the train, but I recognize that if you were to jump in front of this train, it would stop the train from going. Now, would you let me push you in front of the train? If you say yes, I will do it. If you say no, I won't ask again. That'll be that." And imagine now the person says, "You know what? Yes, push me." How many of you would feel at least better in this case? Not necessarily that you would do it, but you'd feel a bit better pushing this person if you first asked them and they were like, "Yeah, sure, I'll do it. I've got consent, got it."
I was gonna say, I just feel better about it, but doing it is still like another story. Even
Yeah,
with
so I 100% agree. I don't know if I'd be able to do it, but at least all of us recognize that there's something at least a little bit better about getting consent here. And what Kant would say, or Kant would explain this feeling of what is different. Well, in this case, you are at least treating them somewhat as an end in themselves. You are taking their desires and their values into consideration. Now, it might still be that it feels wrong because you haven't treated them enough as an end. You're still using them as a meat sack to stop a train, but at least feels a bit better because you've asked them and they've said, "I'm okay with this." You've gotten permission. And therefore, you aren't just using them as a tool. You are also treating them as a human being. So does that make sense to everyone? And you can kind of see how it captures our intuitive idea of there are just certain things that are wrong because they are just violating another person or using them or not treating them in the same way that every human being. It's kind of related to the golden rule, but not quite the exact same. The golden rule of do unto others as you want to whatever. Yeah, that one. It's not quite the same because instead of do unto others as you would want them to do to you, it's more do unto others as you would be able to do to everybody, not just you, but it's a very closely related idea. So everyone on board and understand just what the view is. Again, this is a very famous view, which is worth knowing for its own right, and it kind of captures our intuitions in certain cases. But like consequentialism, it has some issues with it. So anyone there's no right or wrong answers to issues with Kant's deontology, other than the fact that it's terribly named. That is an objectively true fact that all these philosophers just love using big Latin words. It's just the worst. It's just, when you're locked away writing all the time, you have to feel special and important, so you just use big words. So can anyone think of anything off the top of their head where they think, well, this might be an issue with Kant's deontology? There's a few different ones that people have talked about, and there's infinitely many you can come up with. And if you can, I can just run through. This is not like I didn't ask you to read about this, so it's like just off the cuff of this idea that there's one rule and it's always wrong to murder because you can't do it to everybody.
I have to think always of everybody, and it's like there's to every case there's from specific things, it's hard to generalize.
That I think is one of the major issues with the view, is that it does seem that like one of the great things about utilitarianism is it allows you to respect the particular extreme details of the case. If we put 50 million people on this track, a utilitarian can take that into account in their judgments. It looks like, though, a deontologist, you have to make these very big generalizations. And it seems like any rule you ever come up with, you can come up with a counterexample where that rule should be broken. So it seems like one issue with it is that a deontological view cannot explain the fact that if you raise the number of people dying high enough, just about everyone would be willing to kill just about any single person. Like if I told you, here are the choices, here's a gun, I'm the devil, here's a gun, shoot your mother or every other human being on earth dies. Like, I think in that case, even there, most people would be able to kill their mother to prevent the devil from killing every other human being on earth, where just the consequences are so high. Kant would say in that case, you still can't do it. But it seems like that doesn't quite track these extreme cases. Another issue, though, is just like, how do you even describe what you are and aren't allowed to do? Because it seems like the same action can be described in many different ways, and some of them seem okay and others don't. Like, don't murder, that's bad. That we can all agree with. But don't does self-defense count as murder? Don't murder in self-defense? Or like, don't hit someone over the head with a brick. Like, we can all agree you can't do that.
It self-defense in New York, it depends if like if you have the option to run, then you could be charged.
Okay. So it's total, and I think this is the issue here of like, we know you shouldn't murder someone, and we know you shouldn't hit someone over the head with a brick, but then it seems like if you could describe the rule in another case, which is don't hit someone over the head with a brick, except in cases in which somebody's trying to assault you, then it's suddenly okay to hit someone over the head with a brick. Like, it just seems like it becomes very difficult to capture these rules in a nice pithy sentence. And then I think another big issue with it is that one thing about consequentialism is even if you can't calculate on a given case what the right answer is, like it's very difficult to decide what will cause more pleasure or more pain, running late to see my grandma who has been excited to see me all day, but holding the door for someone who has too many groceries. Like, how do those cancel each other out? It's hard to calculate. But it seems like there can be problems with deontology where you can have multiple conflicting duties, and it doesn't even seem like you'd have a way of going about deciding what the right thing to do is. So, for instance, imagine that you promise one friend, I promise I will not give away the surprise party. I will not tell the person they're having a surprise party. I know you've worked so hard to keep this a surprise. And then this other person, one of the other things that Kant says you can't do is lie, because lying, like breaking a promise, if everyone did it, chaos would ensue. Well, it seems like if this potential birthday person walks up to you and goes, are you having a surprise party for me? Well, you can't lie, but you can't break your promise. So what the heck do? You want to go to the consequences, but you're not allowed to do that because you're a deontologist. So conflicting duties is another issue. So it's the conflicting duties and the fact that just about every rule seems to have an exception, and they're very hard to describe. And there's many, many more. If you take an ethics class or are interested in this stuff or want to talk about it, I'm happy to do so. But that's just the general idea here with these two. All right. So computer people, we good?
Yeah.
Awesome. Humans, we good? All right. I'm going to then go back to this ugly chicken scratch from before. So we just looked at two of the more famous ethical theories that claim what makes something right and wrong. We have deontology based on duty, Kant's version. We talked about utilitarianism, consequentialism. What we found is while both of these theories seem to capture certain elements of how we decide, neither one of them seems entirely perfect. They have flaws, they have problems. One thing you could do is say, well, we just need to get more accurate, or maybe we come up with ethics that combines them. But another thing you might say is, well, maybe we were wrong to think there was one right answer in the first place. Maybe there's not just one right thing to do that's the same everywhere, but rather morality is something that can change, or there's no right answer, or something like that. So instead of going down this path of the one right answer, we maybe go down the other path and we go, no, there's no one right answer to what's right and wrong, but rather there could be many answers, or alternatively, something we won't be talking about, no answer. But we'll be discussing the many answers possibility here. So I described it a little bit last time, but cultural relativism is what we're going to be talking about. And what did we say? Something is relative if what? To a concept is relative or true relatively when? What is the definition for it? Or give me some examples of things that are relative. Anyone remember?
You mean like in comparison?
Yeah, so it's the idea of, so for instance, who's taller, me or Kyriakos? That's objectively true. No matter where we are, if we're here, if we're in Africa, if we're on the moon, he's going to be tall. I think you're taller than me. He's going to be taller than me. That's objectively true. However, other things are only true relatively. So for instance, what is on the right now? My marker or my ugly eraser? Well, for you all, it's the ugly eraser. And for you, it is true the ugly eraser is on the right. For me, it is true the marker's on the right. So in a certain sense, if you were standing here and you said the ugly eraser was on the right, you'd be wrong. However, from where you're standing, it is right. So there is a correct answer. It's just the correct answer changes relative to something else. Other things you can think of are like temperature. Temperature changes relative to what room you're in or what place you are. What money you use is relative to the country you're in. Whether something counts as a crime is relative to the jurisdiction you're in. Something might be illegal in one place that isn't illegal in another. So what we're saying with morality being relative to culture is the idea that what is right and what is wrong is literally different from place to place, time to time. So just to show exactly what this means and contrast it, I'm going to draw some beautiful art. We are going to draw beautiful, beautiful art. Am I on the board here? All right. So we've got a rock. All right, computer people, can you see my beautiful drawing?
I can't see the last word. I'm going to assume sacrifice or something.
Yeah, it says sacrifice. I will write it down here more. Gods accept my sacrifice. All right, so what do we have a picture of here? A human sacrifice, yeah. This person is happily killing this person who's less happy on a rock for to placate the gods. Now, in this case, let's first go over our first two views. What would a deontologist say about this case? Is this murdering person? I guess murdering stacks the deck. Is this person with the knife plunging into this person's heart doing something wrong? Yes. Why? Why would a deontologist say this is wrong? It's murder's wrong, and you're treating them simply as an ends. This is your tool to placate the gods. It's wrong. What would a utilitarian say about this case?
Yeah, it's making him happy, so.
It's going to depend. Yeah, it'll depend on how much. So presumably, if this is the only guy that's happy, then this pain of death is going to be worse than him being happy. But if it's a whole society of people, then maybe you could argue it would be better. But there would be a right answer depending on how much pleasure or pain was caused. But in most cases, I mean, it hurts, like getting carved alive probably hurts a lot. So that's a lot of pain, and your whole family is going to be sad. So a utilitarian would probably say this is wrong. Now, what would a cultural relativist say in response? What would they say about this action? Anyone have a guess for what they'd say? Got it.
If it's okay, I guess relative to that culture, then it must be okay. Like overall.
Yeah, so they would respond. If you ask, is this okay? They would begin by asking a question of their own. And their question would be, what are the views of people in that culture? And if you said in this culture, human sacrifice is a common thing that is expected and recognized as okay by most of the people in that culture, then they're going to have to say in that culture, it's okay. If, however, you point to a case, like if, so to go with an actual historical example, if you point to ancient Aztec society in which sacrificing people to the sun god was pretty common, they would have to look, a cultural relativist would look at that and say, in that culture, it was okay to do human sacrifice. Now, if I were to go home tonight and get mad at my neighbor and decide the best way to solve this problem was to sacrifice them to the gods, and I like stabbed my neighbor, a cultural relativist would say, what about that? Yeah, I'm wrong because in this society, it is not acceptable to murder your neighbor just because you're mad at them or you want to placate the gods. So it entirely depends on what the society says and does. If your society has a practice that is recognized and accepted, then in that society, it is okay. If, however, your society says something is not okay, then it's not okay. And the flip side of this is, from the outside, you cannot apply your views onto a different culture's practices. So I cannot, from the outside, look down and say the Aztecs were doing something wrong. All I'm able to say is the Aztecs had different practices and different views on what was right. They had different views, different from mine. If that were done in my society, it would be wrong. But me from the outside cannot say whether it's right or wrong because my society is not their society. Does that view make sense to everybody of what this view is? Are there any questions? Yeah.
Is this a utilitarianism if they are both happy?
So, and that's the thing, I think a utilitarian, so one interesting thing, and I want to talk about this more next time, is utilitarianism can kind of, certain views of cultural relativism, or I guess certain views of utilitarianism end up looking like cultural relativism, because a utilitarian would be able to explain, like if this person were not sad to be getting sacrificed, but were very happy, and this person were very happy, and the society would be very happy, then a utilitarian would be able to say, like, this is the right thing to do for, and they'd be able to account for different cultural factors. So a utilitarian can in some ways explain cultural relativism in a certain sense by saying, well, in that culture, because it's their culture, they get happy. So there is a really nice dovetailing there where the two fit together. And we'll talk more about that one next time, because one of the issues people have with utilitarianism, basically, if you like cultural relativism, then this doesn't apply. But if somebody doesn't like cultural relativism, one of the attacks on utilitarianism that has been given is it leads to cultural relativism, and we don't like cultural relativism. We want objectivism or whatnot. But yeah, that's a really great point to pick up on. So yeah, they're going to say it totally depends on what culture you're in. All right, the last thing I want to discuss today is my favorite three-letter word, why. Why be cultural relativist? And I think there's a couple main reasons, and I want to just open this up too. What is it about cultural relativism that's appealing? And I'm not trying to do this as like a sociological thing of why are you drawn to this, you silly people? Because I don't think that it's clearly wrong. I think cultural relativism might very well be correct on some level. And some days I'm a strong cultural relativist, and some days I'm an objectivist, and some, like, my views on ethics change constantly. I just try to not be a terrible person by any of the views. But why, what is it about cultural relativism that is appealing or a promising view? Kyriakos?
I think maybe it's the most peaceful way for the world to live.
Yeah, so one big thing is, does anyone, oh, yeah.
Also, like, you take into account pretty much everyone across the world.
Yeah, so does anyone know when cultural relativism, what major movement it grew up in response to? The big C word had to do with a bunch of white people showing up on everyone else's shores and taking things. Yeah, it was a response to colonialism of like the 18th century, because what basically the British and everyone else was doing was they were showing up and not, I mean, first off, they were pillaging and taking things, but on top of that, they were saying, this is okay because we are civilized and we are good, and you do things differently than us, and you must be bad and wrong. And so one of the reasons that cultural relativism is like one of the major positive things behind it is it allows you to explain why that was so fucked up. Like, why is it that we look back now and see like colonialism and people coming from a distant land and assuming that because they do it this way, it's the right way. Well, we now can look back and just say, no, you did it differently. And you just happened to be the one with guns because of some like historical accidents and some weird things that happened back in the Middle Ages. And so because of these random things, you happen to have the guns, and that's why you're winning, not because you were morally superior or anything like this. So we can look back and say, well, the colonialists were wrong because people are just different. You know, you eat with a fork, somebody else eats with chopsticks, they're different. But the move from that to, and we're superior and the fork is the better eating utensil because the white man uses it, like, no, that is, you don't get to make that jump. And a cultural relativist gives a nice explanation for why that line of thinking is so screwed up. Now, was that a hand or was that a stretch?
Yes.
Okay, stretch. So yeah, it's anti. And I think that this is one of the major reasons, because as you say, if you can go around and spend less time imposing your views on other people, if it's you do things differently from me and that's okay, I'm going to spend a lot less time fighting with you and trying to force you to do things my way. So it does lead to a more peaceful society. You know, if people spent less time worrying about what other people are up to, then, you know, there'd be a lot less time fighting about any issue in politics.
So you think that's why democracy is so successful, because it allows for progression instead of being stuck with one ethical viewpoint?
So I think, so here's an interesting fact. So democracy and why it's successful is a fascinating thing. Also, why it's unsuccessful is also very fascinating, but that's a separate thing. But I think one of the things to recognize, and one of the reasons democracy is so successful, I think part of it is, yeah, it forces you. One of the reasons that I think democracies are generally, by and large, they tend to be less violent historically than other, and again, it's a generalization where you can find extremely violent democracies and everything. But generally speaking, I think part of the reason that you have less conflict in that sense is that people, you know, the quickest way to get people to become okay with a group that they thought they disliked is interact with individuals of that group. And so like, what's the quickest way for a person, you have a homophobic individual, what's the fastest way to get them to drop their homophobia? Well, have somebody in their family come out. That's the fastest way that it changes. So all of a sudden somebody's like, I do love this person and they're gay, therefore it must be that gay people aren't bad.
But I disagree that democracy leads to less conflict, because if everybody's opinions are okay and people don't agree with each other, that does create conflict. And if there's one opinion that is okay and you can't, you know, like disagree in like dictatorship or something like that, then there's no problem because everybody's going to do the same thing.
I actually think that's a great point. So I think that here's the idea. You have to think about it in group and out group. So if you have one view and everyone follows it to the T, there's not going to be any conflict because there's nothing to fight about. But generally speaking, if this is a democracy and this is a dictatorship, it is more likely for the democracy, and again, this isn't universal, because what can end up happening is you can end up with a democracy that ends up with very strong views of what's right and wrong, and then decides to go all imperialist and take over and install democracies halfway around the world. So that can happen and lead to wars. But generally speaking, it does seem like as long as it's a democracy that is open to other views other than even democracy, then would be not inclined to go to war with a monarchy or a dictatorship. While the dictatorship thinks this is the way it must be, and because within the dictatorship, there's this tendency to everyone has to be this way and anyone on the outside must be evil, then it is more likely that the dictatorship will go to war. But again, within a democracy, you're going to get, in some ways, a lot more fights, because you'll have the people who view this thing and that thing, and because it's all okay and they all get their own news stations, and then we'll be talking in a couple of weeks about Facebook and how that leads to even more problems on top of it.
So do you think progressiveness for a country is bad?
I think that it's a complicated thing where it's a case-by-case basis. And I will be the first to say, in my mind, the ideal government, which let's be clear, is completely impossible because all humans, but a truly enlightened dictatorship in which you had one all-knowing person who is actually, like, if we could create a perfect thing, which we never could because we create it, but the advantages, I mean, there are some genuine disadvantages around democracy that we'll talk about more, but basically shit is slow in a democracy because everyone's got to vote on it. So that is one major issue, is when, like, why is the military a dictatorship? Like, why is it that what the general says is law? Well, stuff has to be fast. You don't have time to debate everything. Oh, and so, like, in a practical sense, what we'll be talking about, why is it that one of the issues that we have today is with all the laws, like, how did we get to the point that now Facebook has to get in front of Congress and everyone's jumping up and down? Well, it's basically the technology moves really, really fast and Congress can't make the laws fast enough. So what ends up happening is we have this policy vacuum where our government cannot keep up with the technology fast enough. Well, compare that to, like, you might disagree with what conclusions they're drawing, but in terms of actual regulation, the Chinese government is much more efficient and effective at controlling things in an internet world. You might not disagree with the direction they're going, but you can't disagree with their effectiveness in controlling it. So I think there are, but on the flip side, I think there are a lot of positives, and I'm not going to say like the enlightened dictatorship I'm imagining is not something that could ever humanly exist, because, you know, look at medieval monarchy, and it's just a crapshoot of the person. When a monarchy or something went well in the Middle Ages and you had a good king, things went great. The problem was their son was always a screw up, and then shit went real bad. So I think that progressiveness, and so I think that in a lot of ways, when it goes well, I think democracy is in just, what's the famous quote? Democracy's something along the lines of, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the other ones, I think is the quote. And so I think there are a lot of yeah. So I think that progressiveness and democracy, when done well, the only issue is just that it can be in certain what's the best one? It's not perfect, and in certain contexts in which you can manipulate the views of large numbers of people, it can become tyrannical in its own strange way.
I think democracy promotes more utilitarianism.
Yes.
It allows for it more.
Yes, but I think an issue can be, though, that what can end up happening is, going back to a lot of the biases and things we talked about before, is very often what you can get people to do is follow something, not because it will, in an ideal world, democracy is going to lead to utilitarianism and like the greatest good for the greatest number, much more than a monarchy would, where a single person is looking out for themselves. However, it's not perfect, because what you can end up doing is, because humans are irrational and have passions, you can get people to end up voting and deciding on things that are not actually for even their own betterment or for the greater good. You get people mad enough at group X, and a democracy suddenly becomes just as violent as any dictatorship. And I think that's, and this is like, to go on a complete tangent of, so Aristotle had this view of governments back in like I want to say like 300s BC, and he thought of all government as cyclical, and it was just basically, you had three different forms of government. You had the many, the few, and the one. And so if you have a government of one, then eventually the good government of one will turn into a dictatorship, and then it will fall, and the government of the many will take over. And then you'll have a good democracy for a while, but then the government of the many, eventually a few people in that democracy will succeed much more and take over, and then they will become the group, and they will decide in their own way how to do it. And at first they might do it for the greater good. Eventually, though, they will start acting selfishly, and the strongest of them will take over, and you end up back at the one, and then it starts all over again. So there are lots of different things. And I think the thing that I think modern technology has taught us is that for democracies to work, certain baselines need to be met. And I think these days, with misinformation and other sorts of things, it's getting harder and harder for those preconditions to be met in a healthy sort of way. All right, so the other thing, so back to the cultural relativist point, the other issue, what was I going to say about cultural relativism? Oh, the other main reason that people like it is, it seems like, well, how do you know what's right or wrong? What told you, or how did you come to know that murder was wrong? Or how did you come to know that lying is wrong? Like just causally, not like what's your thought process, but what brought it about that you came to believe that? You were taught it. You were taught it by parental figures, guardian figures, that sort of thing. And it seems like when you actually look around the world, what people are taught is different. And the things that you were taught are terrible and just god awful. Another culture may have been taught is perfectly fine. And because of that, they're just as convinced that what we're doing is terrible as we are that what they're doing is terrible. And so if, to take an example from the reading is, how many of you would be okay eating a piece of your mother after she died? She died, you before you put her on the ground, you know, you just cut out a piece, maybe fry it up, I guess. I don't know how you cook mother, but how many of you think it would be wrong to do that even? So most people, this is the feeling that Westerners in the modern world and most of history, however, there have been cultures in human history in which the greatest honor you could possibly do to a dead loved one was consume them and make part of them a part of you for eternity. And when you tell people of this culture, we just stick them in the ground. They are appalled. They're like, how could you disrespect your mom like that? That is the most cruel thing ever. So they're just as convinced that what we're doing, and they have the same sort of gagging, sort of like feeling that we have when we talk about eating mom. So if you're certain that eating mom is wrong because you were taught it was wrong, and yet somebody else is so certain that eating mom is right because they were taught it was right, then where do we get this idea that there's some right answer that everyone can point to? It seems rather that maybe all that, you know, maybe I learned to eat with a fork, somebody else learned to eat with chopsticks, someone else was brought up with their hands, and they're all just different. And maybe in your society, you know, if I start eating with my hands at a fancy restaurant, that's in some sense wrong. If I start eating with my hands at a barbecue, that's perfectly fine. In the same way, maybe in my culture, murder is wrong. But if there was a different culture in which human sacrifice was acceptable, or we had to make an example of our enemies, then that would be an okay thing. And so if my reason for thinking it is my gut feeling, and my gut feeling is just a matter of what I was taught, and if you were taught differently and your gut feeling is differently, then maybe at the end of the day, it's just relative to culture. So that's the main motivation. So it's this anti-colonialist thing and this sort of, well, I feel this way because my parents taught me, and if they taught me differently, I would feel differently. Therefore, there must be nothing to morality. Now, just to preview, next time what we're going to be discussing is a particular person's arguments against cultural relativism. And I think there are some genuine issues with cultural relativism as well. And to use the expression, there's a lot of bullets you have to bite if you're willing to be a cultural relativist. And so next time we'll talk about what some of those are. And I don't know how much of the class we'll use next time, but if we want to go on more tangents, we totally can. I love it. These were great questions today. All right, I'm going to stop the recording. Goodbye, online people. I will be posting this to the YouTube